So let's talk about transparency and what we've done in the credibility revolution to try to increase transparency in psychology research. So as I mentioned, transparency is just one of the two pillars of the reforms that have been pushed forward in the credibility revolution. But let's go through a few of the concrete things that we've done to try to improve transparency. So the first, as I've mentioned in the past, is pre-registration. So what is pre-registration? It's quite simple. It's just saying what you're going to do ahead of time, writing it down, putting it in a timestamp document that will become public eventually, so people can see when you made the decisions, what decisions you made, and so on. So that could mean determining your sample size, your measures and manipulations, your analytic strategy, your critical hypothesis test, writing that down. Actually, here I would switch the order. I'd say most people write it down somewhere where it's locked, it's time-stamped, but not necessarily public yet. They then collect data and then they share it. So you can often click a button and make it public after you've collected the data. So basically, this is a way for people to verify when you made the decisions and did you deviate from those decisions? Because as we've talked about before, interpreting a lot of statistics depends on knowing whether there was flexibility. Is this what you decided ahead of time, or could you have changed your mind after you saw the results? And knowing if researchers change their mind or change their analysis after they saw some of the data will affect how much confidence we should have in that result. It's still interesting to know what they learned when they had already looked at their data and changed their analysis. That can be very interesting and fruitful for generating new ideas and new hypotheses. But if we want to be really confident in a result, especially in the context of null hypothesis significance testing or p-values, it's quite important that we know if the researcher was able to make all the decisions and plans ahead of time and follow those and still get what they predicted. So pre-registration is definitely on the rise in psychology. Here's a graph that's already out of date from 2018, looking at the number of pre-registrations on one place that you can pre-register, which is the Open Science Framework. So that black line shows the number of pre-registrations on the Open Science Framework, and the left axis is the one that matches the black line. So you can see as of 2018, there were already 18,000 pre-registrations on the Open Science Framework. There's another website that's very commonly used for pre-registration in psychology called aspredicted.org. So this is just a subset of the pre-registrations that psychologists are registering. And you can see that most of those have been in just the last few years. So 2016, 17, 18, pre-registration really started taking off. The green bars are the journals that offer a special kind of pre-registration called registered reports, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Another form of transparency, and I should add, pre-registration is a form of transparency because it's letting other people verify, making it open to other people to verify when you made which decisions and when you deviated from your plan. So it's being transparent about the timing of your decisions and any deviations from your plan. Another form of transparency is sharing your data and the code associated with it to analyze the data. And this is also something where we've come a really long way. So here's some data from 2006, so well before the credibility revolution. Where the researchers actually what they wanted to do when they started this research project was reanalyze other people's data, and they had a research question about what they would find if they reanalyzed other people's data. But it ended up being a research project about how hard it is to get other people's data because they weren't able to get enough people's data to do their original research project. So they contacted lots of researchers and they documented the reasons that they couldn't get the data. So in 11% of cases, the researchers they contacted shared the data after the first request. So that happens sometimes, but not very often. Another 16% shared the data after reminders. So overall, about 27% shared the data eventually. 35% responded and said that they won't share the data or they're unable to share the data. 4% had undeliverable email addresses. 14% just never replied despite reminders. And 20% promised that they would share the data, but then didn't follow through. So that was in 2006. There have been newer studies, and it's not that much better in terms of when you have to request data from authors, do they send you the data? But what we have seen is an increase in just making sharing data the default. So when you publish the paper, you post the data publicly, and people don't have to ask you anymore. So I'm going to show you some data on that in a second. But another kind of open practice that I'm going to show you data on at the same time is what's called open materials, which is making the materials someone would need in order to run your study, to run your application, publicly available. So in psychology, there's been a big push to try to encourage or nudge people to be more open with their data and their materials and with pre-registration. And some researchers actually looked at, over time, have we seen an increase in those practices in psychology and in other social sciences. So what I'm going to show you is a graph of self-reported behavior over time. So the results of this survey, where they asked researchers, did you ever do this? Pre-register, share your data publicly, like post your data, or post your materials publicly. And if you did, when was the first time you did it? And these are social scientists across several different disciplines. And here's what we see over time. So in 2006, only 20% had done anything. So the black bar is I've done at least one of these things. The green is posting their data. The red is posting your materials. They call it study instruments. And then the orange at the bottom is pre-registering. So you can see almost nobody had pre-registered until very recently. By 2017, it was up to like 10, 15%, 20% of people in the survey had pre-registered. But more than 80% had done one of these practices, mostly posting their data. When we break it down by field, it's a bit higher, I think, in psychology than in many other fields, and lower in sociology than the other fields examined. Another kind of openness is making the paper itself open. So as you might know, most published papers are behind a paywall. You have to have a subscription to read the article. Often as a student, you have a subscription through your university library, but once you're not a student anymore, not affiliated with the university anymore, you may lose access to the research literature, despite the fact that it was often funded with public money, like tax money. So there's a push towards making published papers openly available. And this can be done either by publishing in an open access journal, which is a journal that doesn't require a subscription to read it, which are becoming more common, or posting a version of your paper as a preprint, which is where you post the PDF, probably not formatted by the journal, but same content in a different format, to a website where anybody can access it without a paywall. So this graph shows the popularity of preprints, so how many people have submitted their papers to different preprint servers across different disciplines. And the psychology preprint server is PsyArchive, which is the bottom row in the middle. And you can see if you look on the y-axis, the values vary a lot across different fields. Psychology is one of the top with 3,000 preprints as of May 2019. By now it's going to be even more than that. And in fact, there's some data from just a few months ago. Every month, PsyArchive gets about 450 new submissions and 335,000 downloads. So a lot of these papers are getting at least downloaded, if not read. So that's great news for open access. Another kind of openness that we won't talk much about is open review. So making the peer review process open and transparent. This means sharing what the reviewers and editors say, the critical feedback they give during the peer review process, publishing that along with the paper so that readers can see what are the issues that came up, what are some of the criticisms, etc. Another kind of openness that's really important but doesn't get talked about much in psychology is declaring conflicts of interest. This is more common in medical sciences. We're not very good about this in psychology. Another thing we should be transparent about is which of the authors did which part of the work, and this is called contributorship. So instead of just authorship, we should add a different level of information, which is saying who contributed what, who's responsible for what, how much work did everyone do so that they can get the credit, but also so we know who to ask if we have questions about different parts. And then finally, another important aspect of transparency and openness is removing barriers to entry so that the playing field is level and everybody has an equal chance to get heard, to get their papers looked at, both in a positive and negative way in terms of scrutiny and praise, and giving everyone a chance to participate in science.